So I'm going to talk to you about the anthropological ventures of a church missionary society missionary, John Roscoe, who worked in Uganda and who then also worked not as a missionary anymore, but as an anthropologist in Cambridge and near Cambridge and in other scientific circles until his death in 1932. And mainly what I want to shed light on is the intellectual and scientific contribution of this missionary to the work of the Cambridge-based anthropologist James Fraser. They first started to correspond in 1889 when Roscoe on the mission field answered the questionnaires that Fraser was sending to missionaries across the globe to have more details and more information about many topics that we are going to dive into later. But from those first letters grew a real intellectual friendship and collaboration from 1889 until his death in 1932. And this correspondence, or what is left of it, which is around 140 letters, opens a unique window for historians of missions and anthropology alike, because I think it unveils a work in progress in the study of non-Christian religions at the time of the birth of this discipline, and also reassesses the importance of missionary contributions to anthropology. As you will see, Roscoe did not confine his anthropological work to corresponding with Fraser. He also very soon fostered relationships with other anthropologists from Cambridge, like Alfred Haddon, that Chris just mentioned before in the discussion, and also so some of Fraser's colleagues, but also with some of his fiercest rivals. And what I intend to show here is that this missionary was not just a goldmine for raw data and information to be exploited in Cambridge by Fraser and his likes, but Roscoe saw missionary work and anthropological investigation as two sides of one same coin, intrinsically bound in the context of mission expansion, high imperialism, and scientific progress. And so in many ways, he was one of the pioneer missionaries who heralded a time when missionary organizations would take the study of indigenous systems of beliefs and social organizations into greater account as part of their evangelizing strategy. And this did not come without tension and contradictions on his part. These collaborations and tensions between missions and anthropology have attracted the attention of many historians and missions and science alike, like Timothy Larson, for instance, who in The Slain God, Anthropologists and the Christian Faith examines those issues. In this gallery of portraits, he devotes one chapter to Fraser, who, according to him, had shed a Christian identity, yet counted missionaries among his closest friends and collaborators, Roscoe included. According to Larson, when they reported things that substantiated his theories, Fraser would defend to the hilt missionaries as unrivaled ethnographic authorities, but on the other hand, he would dismiss them as too scriptural or unqualified if their descriptions did not confirm his own findings on religion and religious systems of beliefs. Larson somewhat undermines Fraser's appreciation of Roscoe, as according to some letters and Fraser's obituary of Roscoe, the anthropologist praised the missionary's unwillingness to attempt to explain his evidence with any theoretical statements. So in one word, he was good at collecting data, and it was a great thing that he did not try to theorize about those data. I would argue, from the evidence of the two men's respective works and their correspondence in the long term, that Fraser did deem Roscoe's theoretical insights and assumptions valuable, and did not just view the missionary as a goldmine for raw data. Larsen's gallery of anthropologists' intellectual portraits discusses how findings and theories in the discipline of anthropology have been interpreted as undermining or even discrediting the claims of Christianity, as well as, conversely, how anthropological insights have been perceived to be compatible with or even to reinforce Christian faith. This dual movement also lies at the core of another book on missionaries in science, which does not stop at the study of the interactions between missions and anthropology only, but looks at the involvement of missionaries in other scientific fields as well, like botany, linguistics, and medicine, for instance. So this is the collection of essays edited by the late Patrick Harris and David Maxwell, and entitled The Spiritual in the Secular, Missionaries and Knowledge About Africa. And here they explore the many scientific ramifications that missionary work on the field could take. So what I want to start with here is about this intellectual and scientific friendship between those two men, so Reverend John Roscoe and Professor James Fraser. And this time focusing more on Roscoe than on Fraser, as other chapters that I've just mentioned have done. Roscoe was a civil engineer trained in Liverpool. He did 2 separate tours in Africa as a missionary for the CMS, so the Church of England Missionary Society overseas. First, he was appointed to Mamboya when it was part of British East Africa, so in nowadays Kenya, in 1884. But he was sent home for health reasons in 1889. But soon after his return to England, he joined the CMS Uganda mission in 1891. So he went back to Africa quite soon. He was witness to the various political crises that shook the country as the newly converted Baganda, Protestants and Catholics fought against each other in a series of civil wars. In 1893, Roscoe was ordained in Buganda, and in 1899 he was appointed principal of the Theological College at Mengo in the capital, and then he held that post for 10 years. After which he decided to go back to England for health reasons, but also because he wanted to focus on his anthropological work more thoroughly in an academic environment, namely in this case Cambridge, where he had started to foster an intellectual, scientific and personal friendship with Fraser. The two men had started to correspond as early as 1889, when Fraser sent this appeal for missionaries overseas to send him back some data following his questionnaire. But they met in the flesh during a soirée in Cambridge, which Roscoe had attended while on furlough from Uganda. And Fraser in his diary kept notes of the first conversation he had with the missionary in November 1896, writing down the first elements of Ganda ethnography that Roscoe had summed up for him on that occasion, focusing mainly on totemic elements. So Mr. Roscoe told me that he had spent 12 years in Africa, of which 5 were passed in Uganda. Hence, he considers that he knows the people well. The system of totemism prevails throughout Uganda and is carried out in great detail. The totems are beasts, birds, and fish. Mr. Roscoe did not remember any vegetable. So that's the first trace that we have of the two men meeting in the flesh. And the series of letters that would follow until 1932, when Roscoe died, is but a longer, constantly amended, expanded version of this first conversation. The letters are fragmentary and therefore cannot give us the whole picture, but it seems that Roscoe's CMS supervisors did not really see his anthropological ventures favorably, probably considering that they could be a distraction from his apostolic mission. The University of Cambridge gave Roscoe an honorary MA degree in acknowledgement for his contributions to the ethnography of Uganda. That was 2 years before he had actually published his enormous work on the Baganda in 1911. During that time, Roscoe had started lecturing in various venues and institutions in Cambridge, but also in Oxford, Manchester, at the Royal Institution, and not to mention at the Anthropological Institute. The University of Cambridge gave Roscoe the rectory of Ovington in Norfolk, near Cambridge, in 1912, which, in the words of Fraser, was a recognition by the university of your eminent services to science as well as in the mission field, for I have no doubt that the electors considered both your claims, your scientific and clerical, which you unite in so high and rare a degree. Fraser, as we mentioned, was an atheist and kept repeating to Roscoe that he wished he would give himself wholly to anthropology. And indeed, Fraser soon took Roscoe under his wing when he came back to England, becoming his anthropological mentor, as the dedication at the beginning of his book, The Baganda, shows. So to my friend, Professor Fraser, whose sympathy, encouragement and guidance in my anthropological studies have constantly inspired me to fresh effort. And Fraser discarded the dedication as too flattering, but at the same time he felt a satisfaction to think that I have in any way helped towards the producing of such a record of African life. I am proud to have my name permanently associated with such a book. The letters prior to the publication of the Baganda reveal the degree of Fraser's involvement, his advice on presentation, and role in changing the subtitles and the organization of the book's sections, which reflect his own method of classification. But the letters also show that this collaboration, this correspondence, was not a one-way street, as Roscoe himself proofread many of Fraser's articles and sections of his masterpiece, The Golden Bough, which was first published in 2 volumes from 1890, but then underwent many other editions. What needs to be emphasized, therefore, is that Roscoe's anthropological ventures had other ramifications than just being Fraser's protégé, and that he managed to fit in the scientific circles of the University of Cambridge on his own merits. And here I'm going to explore 3 different aspects of his life after the mission: his collecting activities in relation with the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology of Cambridge, Roscoe's practical anthropology or applied anthropology to the mission field, and finally Roscoe and the fact that he led an ethnological expedition to Central Africa in 1919 and 1920. So first, concerning his collecting activities, so Roscoe contributed actively to the collection of some 800 artifacts for the Museum of Anthropology in Cambridge, which was founded in 1884. The bulk of the museum's Central and Eastern Africa collection was sent from Roscoe, his position as a missionary inclining people to find rare objects which, in his word, were given him as a friend rather than as a purchaser. In fact, the first items given to the museum from Buganda were presents from Apollo Kagwa, who was Buganda's prime minister, Katikiro, and he was Roscoe's friend. Kagwa and his private secretary, the Ganda official Ham Mukasa, had visited Cambridge with missionaries from the CMS in 1902. They had met with Fraser, they had visited the museum's collection in July of that year. They were chaperoned during their 3-day stay in Cambridge by Roscoe and his wife. Mukasa, in his account of his stay in Cambridge, recalls that Fraser gave them coffee, for instance. Kagwa later decided to give 16 items to the museum, most notably sacred royal relics and the remains and regalia of the war god Kibuka. After that, Roscoe continued to add to the collection until 1920. Roscoe sustained a correspondence with the Catholic paleontologist Baron Anatole van Hugel, who was the museum's first curator, explaining to him how difficult it was to get him a royal canoe that Hugel really wanted to have his hands on, knowing how skilled the Baganda were at canoe making. And Roscoe, as was the case for his anthropological investigations, required the help of the Prime Minister of Buganda to find rare artifacts, and was anxious for the museum to understand the value of those objects. You will see, he writes to von Hugel, that the things I am sending are genuine ones and are rare. So again, the question of the authenticity and the rarity of things. In a year or 2, it will be impossible to get them at all. And von Hugel supported Roscoe's quest for rare artifacts financially. This kind of partnership between a missionary in the field and museum curators at home was not at all uncommon, as we have seen from the first panel. And in fact, other members from the Buganda mission had corresponded with scientists at home to provide them with artifacts or specimens. I'm not going to go into the trespass on the botany panel, for instance. But one of Roscoe's colleague, Wilson, was in correspondence with the directors at Kew Gardens, sending him specimens of fern, for instance, because he was completely obsessed with ferns. And so you see those kinds of collaborations. So here you have, for instance, this is Chris' book, and you have some one piece that was collected by Roscoe, a sacred war drum in the Museum of Cambridge, and a bracelet as well. Now moving on to what we could define as applied anthropology for missionaries, which was another branch of activity that Roscoe really got into when he came back home as an invalid. He continued to nurture his connections with missionary organizations, although not so much with the CMS only, but mainly with the British Board of Study for Preparation of Missionaries. This institutional body was created in 1911 in the wake of the 1910 Edinburgh World Missionary Conference, with an aim to make investigations and prepare statements as to the nature of the special preparation required for the different mission fields, and where desirable, to arrange lectures or courses of lectures from experts in special subjects. The Board of Study in 1914 had paved the way for the creation of a College for Missionary Study, which planned to include anthropology in its curriculum, conditional upon the securing of a lecturer who would be able to treat the subject in its bearings or on missionary problems. But, of course, the First World War put an end to this project. But its plans reveal how significant the study of comparative religions anthropology was to be. Although the college never actually saw the light of day, a scheme of a smaller scale was nevertheless implemented. In 1912, the first vacation course for missionary training was set up, which over 4 weeks would be a small beginning of serious and organized missionary study, with the expectation that it may lead to a more thorough preparation of missionaries for their work. Indeed, at a time when shortages of missionary staff were beginning to be felt in Britain, it was all the more important to focus on specialized training, as, in the words of the board, the quality of the missionaries sent out is even more important than the quantity. So here, for instance, you have an example of the kind of curriculum that they would follow. And Roscoe found himself enrolled as part of the staff of the Board of Study, lecturing daily for an hour on anthropology, social and religious, including animism. So here, for instance, you have the timetable, the schedule that missionaries would follow during the course of 3 or 4 weeks, in this case in 1912. And you see that Roscoe is here giving lecturing in anthropology on the right. The board had consulted the renowned anthropologist Alfred Haddon, that we've mentioned previously, for advice, and the latter had proposed the name of his friend John Roscoe to lecture on the topic. Haddon had advised the board in very strong terms on the importance of ethnology for anyone proposing to set out for the mission field. He himself had received many letters of thanks from prospective missionaries who had attended his classes at Cambridge, at that time a fertile recruiting ground for young missionaries. For instance, Arthur Knight, the third Bishop of Rangoon between 1903 and 1909, was one of them, saying to Haddon that your lectures saved me from any danger that might have existed, of lightly estimating native customs, etc., of failing to give them attention and respect. Haddon tried to impress upon the board committee that a good general knowledge of ethnology is more essential as a preparation for mission work than anything else. It is very important to have a general and sympathetic knowledge of the institutions of less advanced societies, as the new ideals inculcated by most missionaries are at first incompatible with the stability of native institutions. Haddon would himself end up lecturing for the board's vacation courses in 1915 on the sociology of primitive people, while Roscoe kept his position as lecturer on anthropology. The missionary was therefore able to contribute to this aspect of practical applied anthropology for missionary endeavour, in which he had always believed. While working for the board, Roscoe had kept up his correspondence with Fraser, asking him for reading advice on some religious systems, and telling him of the progress he felt among his fellow missionaries. I'm going to move on to the third aspect of Roscoe's career back in Cambridge, and that is this ethnological expedition to Central Africa in 1919-1920. And so that was directly linked to this belief in the applied virtues of anthropology in the mission field. He led an ethnological and geographical expedition to Central Africa in 1919 and 1920, and the paternity of this project again is to be attributed to James Fraser, who started mentioning his desire to finance an expedition in Buganda and the surrounding kingdoms as early as 1907, when he moved to the University of Liverpool, to the first chair of social anthropology to be established in Britain. It took him many years, so from 1907 until 1919, to find funding for this expedition. Finally, getting money from a Scottish entrepreneur, Sir Peter Mackie, a Scottish whisky magnate whom Fraser had personally petitioned in Kilmarnock. So that's why Roscoe, aged 58, set sail for Mombasa on his own in June 1919, hoping to find a photographer and a typist there or in Uganda. Until his return in November 1920, he journeyed from Kampala, so the capital of Uganda, to the kingdoms west of Uganda, chiefly to study the pastoral tribes of Ankole, Bunyoro, Karamojo, and the Galas. In Fraser, it was hoped to obtain details of the social anthropology affecting land tenure, inheritance, marriage, and birth. And so in Fraser and Roscoe's mind, the information gathered during the expedition would benefit science, but also administrative officers and missionaries in this context. Okay. Now, moving on to one last point, is how Roscoe and Fraser's contributed to the diffusion of this notion, this tool that was totemism during this period that they corresponded, which is sometimes perceived as the golden age of totemism in the history of anthropology. As I said, so Fraser had relied on missionary data from the field from 1887 onwards, when he had drawn up a series of questions that missionaries could use overseas to gather raw data. He then used those questionnaires to work on his book, whose first edition was published in 1890. As the letters between him and Roscoe show, those questions had a significant weight on Fraser's work. He himself had been a classic scholar first, well-versed in ancient history, and he was averse to going to the field, preferring his position as an armchair anthropologist. So Fraser's questions represent an attempt to construct a template, a schema for the description of primitive peoples, and as such offer insights into the nature of the anthropological project as it was envisioned at the end of the 19th century. The connections he made between ancient societies such as Rome, Athens, or Egypt and present-day tribes were therefore entirely constructed on the data he was sent by missionaries overseas. So Roscoe answered the questions as soon as 1890 and 1891, and Fraser helped him write papers on the Baganda that would then be presented on the missionaries' behalf at the Anthropological Institute. The questions were key to Fraser's method, and in 1907 the Cambridge University Press published a revised version that now contained 500 questions instead of the original 213. In his letters to Roscoe, Fraser often thanks the missionary for handing out copies of the 500 questions to his missionary friends, mentioning, for instance, how glad he is that the Society of Friends, so the Quakers, were taking up anthropology for their missionaries. So Roscoe was helping spreading out this method of the questionnaire. He encouraged his fellow missionaries from various denominations to take an interest in all things native for their own sake, the sake of Christian expansion, and the sake of scientific progress. So here you have the questions here. For instance, the chapter on tribes, clans, and totemism, a key concept to Fraser's anthropological work. Sorry. So what I wanted to show here is that even though Roscoe used the whole method of the questionnaire, which was otherwise also criticized by some of Fraser's colleagues, such as Rivers, for instance, who found that the results would necessarily be unreliable, and who preferred the tangible evidence of physical culture, archaeology, and anthropometrical analysis. Roscoe, who had corresponded with Rivers himself, had used both the questionnaire and anthropometric tables in his inquiries, showing that he could prove versatile in terms of anthropological schools of thought and methods. And so in the annexes of his book, De Baganda, you have more than 30 anthropometric measurements that were used and that he made on the field with the help of some of his fellow missionaries. He was then going to give them for perusal to other anthropologists and other scientists at Cambridge. Of course, he had been able to devise those tables thanks to his unfettered access to Ganda people of all clans, traveling throughout the country or receiving visitors in the mission house. His friendship with the Katikiro, the Prime Minister, Kagwa, made introductions easier with the men and women he wanted to study. And in fact, in this very table, you have even the measurements. The second column is the measurement of the Prime Minister himself. So just like many other members of the London and Cambridge anthropological circles, Roscoe was therefore not averse to combining various anthropological methods in his description of the Baganda, even though it is Fraser's influence that transpires clearly from his work as well. So just to conclude very quickly, as a mentor and later a colleague and intimate friend, Fraser influenced and shaped Roscoe's study of Baganda religious systems, just as his own anthropological work also benefited from the missionaries' input. By examining the correspondence between Roscoe and Fraser and focusing on Roscoe's later anthropological work in connection with other Cambridge anthropologists, this paper wanted to focus on Roscoe's scientific interests and their practical ramifications. Roscoe's career also highlights the complex relationship between missionary service and anthropological work, often too simplistically described as occupying opposite poles, one supposedly wishing to destroy and replace what the other wants to preserve and record. And Roscoe was well aware of this contradiction, as he mentions it in his replies to Fraser's questionnaire. For instance, in 1890, had the work been done 12 years earlier, it would have been much easier. We should have been able to get all people who would have given reasons for some of the customs. Now I may question 20 people without gaining the point I require. So there's this sense of urgency as well at this period of trying to get information that is soon vanishing. This friendship and scientific collaboration represents one of many such cases in point that call for a more thorough examination of the interactions between missionaries and pioneering anthropologists and scientists in the comparative study of religion. In another recent volume on the interactions of missions and sciences, the French historian of missions Claude Prudhomme reiterates the need to focus more closely on the 1850-1940 period in French, American, and British missionary and scientific circles, which have seen a triangular relationship emerge between the birth of missiology, the claim of mission studies to a scientific status, and the expansion of modernity. The example of Roscoe and Fraser illustrates this dual objective that those polyvalent missionaries tried to reach, to connect the progress of the sciences and the progress of missions, either by demonstrating the usefulness of the sciences to missionary work, or the contribution by the missions to scientific progress. The more ambitious second goal was to promote the study of missions to the rank of a new science, based on scientific works taught in academic establishments and disseminated in specialist journals. One clear sign that the serious systematic study of non-Christian religions was doting a renewed significance among missionary organizations is the investigation entrusted to Commission 4 of the Edinburgh World Missionary Conference in 1910 on the Christian message in relation to non-Christian religions. The Commission devised a questionnaire on religions that echoes those that were disseminated by Fraser and his anthropological colleagues, but with a Christian gloss that encouraged its respondents to identify analogies and correspondences with a Western Christian understanding of religious faith. So the importance, if somewhat biased, given to indigenous religions and their necessary study by missionaries during the 1910 conference is but another symptom of the increasing interaction between mission and science during the period that stretches from the late 1880s and the 1930s, which not so coincidentally corresponds to the period during which, Fraser and Roscoe developed their friendship and scientific collaboration. Thank you.